These little spices don't look like much today, but on the 18th century American frontier, they were sought after, breaking the monotony of backwoods ingredients. And for them to reach the backwoods of western Virginia, Tennessee, or early Kentucky, they had to cross oceans, pass through empires, storms, merchants, traders, and the wilderness itself. Today, we're tracing the incredible journey of salt, pepper, nutmeg, and allspice. Spices documented as being purchased by people living along the frontier or headed into America's first far west. So stick around, this is one spicy tale, and I know you're not going to want to miss it. Salt is the outlier in our lineup. Unlike other spices, salt was not exotic, but it was essential, perhaps one of the most essential commodities a family could have out on the frontier. The landscape provided some opportunities for people to produce it themselves, but they also bought it, and they bought it quite a lot. And that includes everyone from settlers to long hunters. And we know that because salt shows up so frequently in the account records, and it occurs so much that it's almost obvious just from the purchase that it's not only for flavoring, it's also for survival. Salt at the McCorkle store in 1774 was 1 bushel for 10 shillings, and that, by my estimation, comes close to $116 in today's buying power. Now, it also sold in other amounts, such as by the peck, or about 2 dry gallons for 2 shillings 6 pence, and that's about $23. Now, as a quick note, today's calculations don't take into account wage comparisons. They're based on buying power. So as an individual item, it may not seem like a lot of money today, but by comparison to their wage standards, things may have seemed a lot more expensive. Salt came from multiple sources to include the global trade, but it also came from local sources, places like Blue Licks, Kentucky, and Saltville, Virginia, where people gathered up the salt water emanating from the ground and boiling it down until they got the resulting crystals. I mentioned earlier that salt was for survival. That's not me being dramatic. That's very true. Imagine slaughtering an animal, whether it's domestic or going out hunting and killing an animal in August in Virginia, for example. You have to salt that meat quickly, otherwise it's going to spoil almost immediately. And salt was the main preservative for being able to keep meat for a much longer period of time. Now, I'm including salt in this video because it's a flavor of the frontier, right? People were eating so much of it based on its use as a preservative and as a flavoring. Now, because I'm mentioning salt, I also feel like I need to mention its sweeter cousin, sugar. And sugar at the time would have likely been more commonly the brown type sugar, or unprocessed natural sugar as we refer to it today, though they did certainly have the processed white sugar in the 18th century also. And they bought it alongside things like rum and bohea tea. Bohea tea being a smoked black tea that was very common in the colonies and also very common along frontier stores. And we know that again from the frontier store records. And from one of those frontier stores, the Shelby store, located along the Holston River near modern-day Bristol, Tennessee, Daniel Boone himself purchased 17¼ pounds of sugar there in February of 1773, and he purchased it along with rum. Our next spice is black pepper, and it's one of those spices that's been traded really almost longer than any other spice in human history. And by the 1700s, it's being grown and traded by multiple empires, to include the Dutch, the Portuguese, and the British. Pepper reached the American colonies mostly through British merchant networks. It was packed into barrels, crammed into ship holds, and brought across the Atlantic to major colonial ports like Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, and Savannah. From there, pepper traveled inland through pack horses and wagons, and it made its way to places like the Shenandoah Valley, the Clinch and Holston River regions, and down flatboats along the Ohio River. And from there, it made its way into the bags and tins of ordinary people. Pepper wasn't as rare as nutmeg and other spices, but it was still expensive. A pound of it at the McCorkle store in 1774 was 3 shillings 6 pence, or about $30 today. An equivalent today is less than half of that. Amazon's selling a pound for $10. Next up is allspice, sometimes called pimento or Jamaica pepper. And unlike spices like nutmeg, this one came from the Western Hemisphere, mostly Jamaica and the Caribbean. And British merchants were taking barrels upon barrels of it northward to colonial ports. And from those ports, allspice followed the same overland routes into the frontier. The Great Wagon Road, pack horse trains through the Blue Ridge Mountains, and wagon caravans supplying frontier stores, and flatboats headed down the Ohio River. Now, the English actually gave the berry its name because they likened the flavor and the aroma to the combined flavors of nutmeg, cinnamon, and clove. In 1774, the McCorkle store sold allspice in a count. I don't know what count that was, or I don't know what weight that was, for 1 shilling 9 pence. And that would be about $10 to $12 in today's money. Allspice was a favorite because it was strong and it was long-lasting, and it could flavor anything from pies to cookies to meats. Allspice wasn't a rare curiosity. It was a dependable spice that was also available, and it could stand in for less available spices like cinnamon and cloves. Now, it's kind of fallen out of favor for a lot of American cooking today outside of things like desserts and sweets, but in the 18th century, it was like the Swiss Army knife of spices. Now, this little guy was one of the most valuable spices of the early modern world. Nutmeg grows naturally on just a handful of volcanic islands in the East Indies, specifically the Banda Islands of Indonesia. For centuries, whoever controlled the Bandas controlled the world's nutmeg trade. In the 1600s and 1700s, that was almost exclusively the Dutch East India Company, who competed for control from the British East India Company, eventually conceding that the Dutch would control the Banda Islands and their spices while the British acquired, as part of the nutmeg trade, the quaint hamlet of New Amsterdam, now better known as New York City. Now imagine being a settler somewhere in Western Virginia, or even further than that, somewhere that eventually becomes West Virginia, Tennessee, or Kentucky. The nutmeg in your possession traveled from the Banda Islands to Batavia, or modern-day Jakarta, across the Indian Ocean, around the Cape of Good Hope, because there's no such thing as the Suez Canal, across the Atlantic and into European ports, and then back across the Atlantic again to the American colonies, and then into warehouses from Boston all the way to Savannah, and finally loaded onto wagons and headed west. By the time nutmeg reached a frontier store like McCorkle's, Spencer's, or Hook's, it had traveled over 10,000 miles. And people gladly bought it. One nutmeg at the McCorkle store was 3 pence in 1774, and by my estimation, that's about $2 on average. And by comparison, Amazon currently has a container of 15 to 17 nutmegs for $6.49. Nutmeg, like other spices, was also used in medicine, and it's recommended in some 18th century texts to grate it into food and drink for things like, quote, fever with violent purging and vomiting. So it's possible that people purchasing nutmeg weren't just buying it for flavor. It's also possible that they were purchasing it to help them feel better. So by the time these spices reached a frontier store like McCorkle's, they had passed through empire-level trade networks, ocean crossings, colonial merchants, wagon roads, pack horse trains, and finally into the stores supplying families beyond the mountains. So what seems so small and commonplace today actually represented a global journey in the 18th century, and it wasn't just coming through Virginia. In Mark Baker's timeless classic, Sons of a Trackless Forest, he documents spices like allspice, and nutmeg, and mace, and clove, and cinnamon, all coming down the Ohio River from Fort Pitt, which is modern-day Pittsburgh, by flatboat into the frontier. So the next time you sprinkle pepper onto your supper, or grate some nutmeg into a drink, remember that those spices in the 18th century traveled farther than most people would ever imagine even traveling in their entire lives. So the frontier may have been remote, but it was never fully disconnected. Even the smallest log cabin could have some link back to a global trade network that began thousands and thousands of miles away. But what were they doing with all these spices? Well, that's a little bit harder of a question to answer. I find it hard to believe that they would be making cakes and pies and cookies with all this allspice and nutmeg, especially when the diet was so largely meat-based. I think it's reasonable to believe that they were in part making kitchen pepper with it, and that's exactly what I'm going to do with mine on the next episode of the Deerskin Diary. Now, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you spending your time with me once again, and I look forward to cooking a dish with that kitchen pepper with you on the next episode. So we'll see you next time on the Deerskin Diary. You're not a frontiersman if you don't groan like that when you stand up.